Hello everybody, it's a great pleasure to have Paul Radzyanko today in our studio. Paul is American-Georgian business leader, manager, winemaker, and explorer in many aspects of life. Paul, thank you for giving your time to the video blog audience. We are going to speak today about Sir Hubert Wilkins and a few books which are written about this great but relatively less known explorer. And the first question I would like to ask is, you have told me at some point that you are someone who have loved to have written these books. So why is that?
I guess what goes around comes around in some ways. It's sort of fun. It is a pleasure to be with you here again. 40 years ago, I was very active collecting the history of polar exploration. North Pole, the Arctic, the Antarctic, very interesting areas, very risky environments, but it's a frontier. And we're all pushing frontiers in our lives, so I felt a certain comfort in exploring that aspect of the physical geography of the planet and what people did to explore it. And in the course of collecting what I called the heroic era of Antarctic exploration, where you have figures such as Scott, Amundsen, well, you get finally around to a guy called Sir Ernest Shackleton. And Sir Ernest Shackleton, this is actually a book relating to his last expedition, the one on which he died. And out of the 4 expeditions that Shackleton took to the Antarctic, the only person who ever died on one of his expeditions under his direct command was himself. He took care of his people, the heroic rescue of the Endurance and all that. And so I finally got to the last expedition, and I ran across a name that I'd never heard before, George Wilkins, who seemed to be sort of a very competent person who was involved in photography, was involved in botany and naturalist work, and generally was highly regarded. And he made sort of a offhand comment about Shackleton when he met him before Shackleton died, said, you know, the old boy has been around a lot. This is sort of a very worthwhile sort of last hurrah for him here in the Antarctic. And I said, you know, this guy has sort of an interesting way of looking at things. And I started reading up on him and doing a little research. And sometimes when you start looking, you find the unexpected. And I discovered that there was a foundation dedicated to Sir Hubert Wilkins. Ah, yes, same guy. In Pennsylvania, about 2 hours, 3 hours from where I was living at the time. And I thought that, gee, maybe they probably have some of his artifacts. Well, I was not prepared for what I found there. There was a couple living in this house in Montrose, Pennsylvania, a man who had been the former masseur for Lady Wilkins, who lived out her days there, and his wife, who, well, I guess he was the factotum, she was the masseuse for Lady Wilkins. And I couldn't quite figure out what the relations was, but when I talked to them on the phone, they said, oh, we're going to make a museum dedicated to Sir Hubert Wilkins. We have a lot of his artifacts. And of course, as a collector, wow, as a researcher, wow, this could be very interesting adventure. So I just jumped in a car and drove out there in winter and came to this little farmhouse with a couple of barns attached. And they started showing me the place. And I went into shock. They had built a barn. They said very proudly, we opened the door and said, this will be our museum. I looked in the roof, and because the way they had built the roof, there was condensation coming through on the nails that had been driven all the way through the roof, dripping down on all sorts of artifacts. I couldn't figure out what it was. I saw I saw a sled, I saw an organ of all things, racks and racks of papers and stuff like that. And I said, these people need help. They have no idea what they're doing. So, not having any idea what they're doing, I said, what does the foundation do? And they said, we're going to have a museum here. And this is, actually I just found this a couple of days ago in our belongings. This is the membership card for a foundation that the most important thing was donation and your name and address. And there's no information about the foundation or what it does. So with a friend of mine, we decided to try to help them. And one of the first things we were going to do is to write a monogram. This was 1981. A monogram on the 50th anniversary of the Wilkins submarine expedition. And Wilkins had decided to take a submarine under the ice of the north, to the North Pole. Amazingly crazy adventure, considering he was using a decrepit World War I submarine. Anyhow, it's a phenomenal saga and all this kind of thing. And we started working on it. And from a philatelic point of view, we found that on the back end of this application form, they had the original cachets and things like that, that the expedition used to try to raise money by sending out mail from the expedition from its various destinations. Well, the long and the short of it is, Dave and I put in quite a bit of support and money. We offered to buy things that were duplicated. In the process, we learned all sorts of things, like stopping in Tristan da Cunha, learning about his Arctic flights. And that led me to understand that there was this huge race to reach the North Pole in the 1920s by air. And with Byrd and Wilkins and others there was competition to be the first. And so this got more and more interesting because he's a navigator, he's a photographer, he's a naturalist. So a picture gradually started to develop that this is a very interesting man. And at one point I understood that he had a goal that basically was the lodestar of his life. He wanted, well, he had been traumatized by what happened to his parents. They had a station in Australia, and they were wiped out by a drought. Nobody had seen it coming. Nobody had taken any preventative measures, obviously. So his parents were wiped out. And at that point in time, he thought, gosh, how can we prevent something like this from ever happening again? He says, I would like to find a way to predict the weather better so that people like my parents aren't wiped out. And that was his overarching goal for the next 50 years or so. And this is what he went through. But the way he went about doing it, acquiring the skill set, then you need a truly an amazing guy. Unfortunately, as I was beginning to discover this stuff, the folks at the foundation said, we don't think you're doing anything, and they decided to sue us. And I don't react well to frivolous claims. And I ended up breaking the foundation and forcing them to take all these artifacts that were rotting in this barn and to donate them to Ohio State University, which had the Byrd Polar Research Center, which was already quite a large and substantial collection. And I had a bittersweet taste in my mouth at that point in time. And although I had a few artifacts that I had legitimately bought from them that they did not need or they had in duplicate or something like that, I basically forgot about it. Until we started to move to Georgia, and we had to lived in a house for 30 years. You got to get rid of stuff. And the stuff that I didn't need, I basically put out to auction, but one fellow kept buying from me, and we asked me some questions, and gradually we got to know each other. And he said, I have something interesting to tell you. And I said, okay. He said, Jeff Maynard, this is an Australian writer, has been helped an enormous amount by the archive that you got placed into Ohio State University. And he has actually written several books on Wilkins, the likes of which you have never seen before that. Lowell Thomas had written a very, shall I say, shallow biography of him that Wilkins' estranged and widow had basically wanted to influence Lowell to write what she thought should be known about Wilkins. So it wasn't really a good research document. And the next thing I knew, first book that arrived is by Jeff Maynard, Wings of Ice, The Riddle of the Polar Air Race. And this was, of course, an area that I was very interested in, so boy, I read that in a hurry. Then we have Antarctica's Lost Aviator, who did the first flight ever in the Antarctic from Deception Island. But then it got even more interesting. He was a war photographer in World War I, documenting and chronicling right in the front lines. The guy must have been completely either insane or totally self-confident. But he was out there lugging these huge cameras that you had back, 100 years ago, right into the front lines, photographing soldiers being there the next day. And I had read something about that, but nothing to this detail. So what actually happened? Jeff Maynard, well, he was lucky because, well, let's put it this way. If I had been able to really work with those people in the foundation and get into all the documents and things that they had, I wouldn't be here probably today. It's on some book trail or something like that. I don't know. It would be very nice. But I am absolutely thrilled that Jeff, what he had to do to assemble this information, because over this interval of time, first Lady Wilkins had died, so there was Winston and Marley who were there. Then Winston died. Then Marley died, leaving everything to one son, but then just before she died, she disinherited him and gave it to the other son, but he came down with a car from up north and basically filled the car with everything he could take and went away. The other son had an auction, and then they sold the house, and he took a few boxes of memorabilia back to Arizona with him. So all of a sudden, the stuff is all over the place. Jeff Maynard went and reconstructed everything. Working together with Ohio State University, he actually tracked down one son. After much communication, the son said, the stuff's just sitting in a shed. You can have it all. Treasure trove. He kept finding stuff from various auctions or various things that were coming back up on the market. He's still in correspondence with the other son in Arizona, who was so infuriated by the way Ohio State University had said, hey, everything should have been turned over to us, which is what our settlement agreement was. But the Rosses had hidden stuff from Ohio State University. They wouldn't let me close into the process, so everything got. And so far it looks as though, with a few gaps left, this amazing guy, Jeff Maynard, has pulled together a history. And then he started finding out incredible things, like he was never home. So he bought this house in Montrose, Pennsylvania. From all over the world, stuff kept appearing there. Lady Wilkins was leading her own life with her live-in. And she couldn't care less about her husband except his fame and the fact that she was now Lady. Anyhow, it's a whole long story. So stuff was destroyed, stuff was edited. She wanted to expunge from any of the documents that were there any mention of any other woman in this man's life, even his previous fiancée, whom he, anyhow. So this guy is a real sleuth, and he's found an amazing amount of things. And the latest book, and the one that we seem to have bonded over, this is a book that for the first time all over the career, everything that he ever did, all aspects, not in great depth, but enough to give a real sense of who the man was and who his skill set was. First time now, after so many years after his death, we're beginning to see a picture of the real man emerge, and he was an amazing individual. And his work was recognized in a very strange way posthumously, because his ashes were spread by a submarine at the North Pole. So talk about a fitting end for a great explorer who made the whole issue of climate prediction and forecasting, using submarines, using polar bases. Everything he dreamed about and pushed for has basically happened. And nobody really realized this has just happened organically because it made sense. And of course, if you want to hear the words of this man himself, they put together a compendium of some of his letters that are indicative of some of these areas. And I think that the next book that has to come out, so this is a preview, I hope, the next book has to come out is how Jeff tracked down all the artifacts, all the things. And there are a couple of surprises that I know about that I can't talk about because it's up to Jeff to publicize them. But he's done some truly amazing work. So this is not only a tribute to the writing or the subject material, it's a tribute to sleuthing and research. And that's why I'm just really pleased to just give you an inkling about what an amazing guy this fellow Wilkins was. I'm sure if people want to get the books, paperbacks are probably easier than, well, they'll be sent. I don't know what the mails are doing these days, but you certainly received yours, and I received mine 2 months after the fact, 2 months in transit. So that's a short overview. Don't get me started beyond this.
Mail seems to have not developed too much after Wilkins times. I mean, 2 months transportation from Australia. But fascinating story, Paul. Thank you, really. It's a really subject of another book, I suppose. But let's return to Sir Hubert Wilkins, and let me ask you about the skills that he possessed. You think the lessons, what we can learn from his life.
It's sort of hard to figure out where to start. He basically didn't see a future for himself in Melbourne. I guess I went into town after the ranch failed. So and by the way, what's interesting about Wilkins is depending on what you read written by him or written about, or what was represented, what he said later on in life, he started creating certain myths about himself and certain legends, or sort of would shade the truth. And, nothing, I mean, no falsification of scientific achievements, but, did he or did he not stow away on a ship to get from Melbourne to Sydney? There's various, it just wanted to make himself sound a little perhaps more romantic or anything like that. But supposedly he did stow away on a ship, ran away from home, went to Sydney. And this was just when movies were beginning. So he learned about making movies. So this was one skill set. Then somehow he ended up going on an expedition, on several expeditions, including with Stephenson, Wilhelm Stephenson, a great explorer in the Arctic, and was involved in naturalist work and taking specimens and photography and all this kind of. So he had acquired a skill set. He had sort of a mechanical skill because he was working with the movie pictures also, so he learned that skill as well. Then somewhere along the line he picked up naturalist knowledge. And then he acquired experience in the Arctic regions, which was again pushing him in this direction of his idea of you've got to know that area to be able to predict weather. And Then he was drafted into, well, not drafted, he was invited to participate in the war, but as a photographer, and there he did the major historic record of World War I photography. So he was working under wartime conditions. And then he ended up as a naturalist on the Shackleton's last expedition. And then he was, again, pulled to the Arctic, so he got sponsorship for various flights to the Arctic, where he became a very successful navigator. And in fact, he did the most amazing flights from Barrow, Alaska to Spitsbergen across the North Pole, 20 and a half hours, and not exactly the most modern airplane. An incredible feat of navigation and flying. Then he kept parlaying that, made his way to the Antarctic 4 times with Ellsworth. And Lincoln Ellsworth bankrolled the expeditions, but the guy who made everything happen was Wilkins. So he was into logistics, he was into photography, he was into flying. He was a very creative mind. For instance, he, as far as I know, he made the first film ever shot through the blades of a rotating propeller. So in flight, how do you make a film through there? Well, on the little old airplane that he was on, he crawled onto the fuselage with his camera, and while it was flying, that's how you learn how to do it. So he was very hands-on, and he just kept acquiring more and more skills, and always thinking, always writing, lots of journals, lots of letters. Some pieces are missing. And I think he was lucky as well. But as the saying goes, a good player makes his own luck. But did I sort of get off the track?
No, it was fantastic. And actually, let me ask you about the second aspect of my interest into his life. What are the lessons learned from this amazing man in a very different time in contemporary Georgia and maybe worldwide for today's world?
Well, I think there are certain enduring qualities that humans have that are valid through space and time. And by the way, space and time, I shouldn't have said that, because he actually tried to do, while he was in the Arctic, he was trying to do telepathic experiments in telepathy back to Europe. I mean, he was trying everything. This guy was amazing. I would say that you need something, people need goals. And I think at a very early age, when he was traumatized by what happened on the station, he formed a goal. How do I make things better, not only so things like this don't happen again? And he envisaged the fact that the polar regions have great effect on the weather, and this was an anchor that kept him going. This was his lodestar. He wanted, and he never deviated for this. So I would say that the lesson there is, if you have a goal, and the earlier in life that one gets a goal, the talent, I guess, that he showed in this case was that he recognized a good idea. He wasn't sure he knew all the implications, but he said, I think I'm onto something. And he clung to it, and he developed it. And the second thing is, when you go about trying to meet your goal, it's very rarely in life have we ever gone through a straight line. I'm sure you haven't. I know I haven't. Yeah. And the fact is that you have to a greater or lesser extent, on a regular basis throughout our lives, we have to reinvent ourselves, acquire the new skills to do it. So you have to be adaptable and have flexibility. But this is, I think, also a story of his life. And I think once you put all those elements together, the one thing that sort of caps it all, it was his sense of responsibility, not only to himself, but to those around him. And it was a sense of positive responsibility. He wanted to make things better. So his motivation as we can say, he was on the light side of the force. And he kept pushing in that direction. And I think these are qualities that I think that are important for people to have today, in the past, in the future, anywhere.
Yes, indeed, Paul. I thank you for these wise recollections and description of wisdom from this amazing man's life. And thank you for visiting us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for allowing me to enjoy myself as much as I have. Thank you.